And welcome back. We are going to continue looking at things in our game, but before we move forward and start using some of these new techniques in our game, we're going to have a small side discussion about one of those things we're going to need to know, which is that of prefabs. Now, we have used prefabs before. In fact, we've seen them in our game, but now we're going to take time to look at a little bit more what exactly a prefab is. So, addressing that question, what is a prefab? As I mentioned, we've seen and used prefabs in our games before. But these are simply just game objects that we take and turn into, you can think of as a reusable template. There's two different pieces to this. The original one that we converted into that prefab is what we call the prefab, whereas anything that is a copy of that prefabrication is what's known as an instance. All right, so another way to think of what an instance is, it's a copy, right? So these are the two things that we're going to have to deal with. And one of the cool things is by making an object into a prefab, we can then easily load it into any scene in our game. We don't have to necessarily go and recreate it every time we have a new scene because that prefab is already going to exist within our game. So I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to scooch on over here to the outside of my game here, and let's go ahead and just, to get a good sense of this, I'm just going to go ahead and create a 2D circle here. And I'm just going to have this exist here. Again, I'm not going to keep this in our final game. This is just solely for the purpose of showing what a prefab is and how we can use it. Now let's just go ahead and make some quick edits to the circle. So I'm just going to go in here and let's just go ahead and scale this up. Let's just double this in the X and Y, for example, just so it's a little bigger. And let's just go ahead and change the color of this just so we get something to look at. How about a nice red circle? That looks pretty good. And we know before, like, we want to make copies of this, for example. So if I go over to my project window, I'm actually going to bring this back over just a little bit here. And if I were to make copies of this, say I duplicate this a couple times, that's all great. It's real easy. Of course, now we got a bunch of circles just all kind of sitting here on top of each other. Boom, boom, boom. There they are. However, if I make change to one circle, so let's say I take this original circle and I want to now make him green. Okay, that's no problem. Now, though, I gotta go and I gotta go edit all these other ones. Or I try to, I want to scale these down. I wanted to change the size of this circle here. So I'm going to go ahead and change it. Anything I do is only going to affect that one circle. It's not going to affect these other circles that I've made. And that is, of course, where prefabbing can start coming in handy. Because if I realize, I need to change this across the board or across multiple scenes, it can be real painful. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove these other circles that I created. And all I need to do to make a prefab, if you recall, is we would simply drag that down into our assets. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and preliminarily create a prefab folder here. And of course, if I right-click and choose prefab, that's not exactly what I want here. So I'm just going to delete this guy. Accidentally, wrongly, I wanted to create a folder. There we go. Again, a little ahead of myself. And we're going to call this our prefab folder. And I'm just going to leave this here, and we can, of course, use this later on for when we use prefabs in our game. But for now, I'm just going to use this for the purpose of the circle. So I'm going to drag the circle in, and when I drag it in, you can see that it's now circle.prefab. You can see that the icon now changed to that familiar blue cube that we've seen before. And just like that, I now have a blue circle. And now the cool thing about this is I can, of course, just add these in here. And you can see as I add them in, they are sharing that prefab property. All right. Now, other things that we can do is, as you might be familiar with, if I edit things in the prefab, it should affect everything else. So I'm just going to first spread out these circles here just so we got them all out so we can see them. And so I'm going to go back to my prefab. And let's just say I change that color again. And, I don't want a green circle. Maybe I want a blue circle. You'll notice that it then applies it to everything within inside of that prefab. I don't have to go to each individual circle and change it. Simply if I say, I want this to be 1.5 times as big. And just like that, it can change all of them. I don't have to go through and try to manipulate the properties of each one of these. Yes, I can go and select all these and say, I want to change them, make them yellow, stuff like that. But by manipulating the prefab, it's just simply one way for me to easily change the properties of one thing without affecting everything else. Now, of course, you obviously can still go to individual objects and change, hey, I want this individual circle to be green. That's perfectly fine, but it still gives you control over the whole objects as a whole. Now, a couple of things I want to point out here with prefabs is you'll notice that along the sides of these, you have these little arrows. So if I go ahead and click on the arrow, it takes us into this kind of zoomed in piece, and that's showing this circle here. So it's modifying the prefab of circle here. And that is now, of course, this original circle object, but it's the prefab. And in here, I can go ahead and modify things. So, for example, if I say, I want to go ahead and let's say take the Y to 2, just a more of an egg shape here. And if I hit this back arrow that's hiding right up here, you can see it now applies that to all of these shapes here. Now, an interesting thing is, as you notice, even though we changed the color of that one, it didn't change the color of everything, all right? Because that is an individual modification. And if I look at that individual shape here that is green, you can see here color is actually bolded. If I look at this yellow one just for comparison, you can see that is showing that that is the color that has been modified for the individual piece here. Similarly, if I said, you know what, I don't want this green one to be scaled. I want maybe I just want this bottom yellow one. I want this one to remain 1.5, right? And so that's going to be that. And maybe, you know, I want to scale this one just a little bit. Maybe I want to make him just a little bit bigger here. I'm going to use a rect tool. I'm just going to scale him up a little bit. Boom, that looks pretty good. And so now you can see we have these different pieces in here. It doesn't affect the prefab really much at all, because if I look at my prefab, this is still this original circle here. And if I were to say, you know what, I want to change this so that way it affects everything else, you know, you can do that, but just remember that it can override some of your other properties here. So I'm going to go in here and I start manipulating this. So you can see the color doesn't change because we had changed it out here in our hierarchy. So these, of course, are yellow. So those are just things to keep in mind as you start manipulating your prefabs, that if we make changes to the individual object here, it's going to pretty much lock that property out from the prefab. But if I were to drag in a fresh circle now, so let's just say I will put one more circle into my game here. All right, you can see it's now that green circle that I have here. In fact, if I go ahead and change this one back to a blue, you can see it grabs that blue tone that's here within that prefab. But that's just our quick rundown with how prefabs work. Again, these are things we've seen, things that we have worked with. And what I want you to do as a challenge is go ahead and, instead of using a circle like I've shown here, go ahead and create your own prefab. And just, you know, you're not going to keep it in your final game. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and delete mine out of here right now, just so that way I don't have to worry with these. There they go. And I'm going to delete this circle prefab because I won't need it. But I want you to go ahead and challenge yourself. Go ahead and see if you can create a couple simple sprites, whether it's a circle, a square, triangle, whatever it is, and go ahead and make a prefab out of it. And then see what you can do to manipulate those properties and how those different changes might affect that object. And then think about that and how that might extend to what we're going to be doing with our sprites and how that is going to affect our final game.